There are stories in history that begin with a bang, with gunfire, glory, and the sound of horses running wild through the dust. But this one begins with a quiet cough. That cough would echo across the American frontier. It would shape the legend of a man who wasn't born to be a killer or an outlaw or a hero, but somehow became all three. His name was John Henry Holliday, but the world would come to know him as Doc Holliday, the dying gunslinger who became a legend. John Henry Holliday was born on August 14, 1851, in the small town of Griffin, Georgia. He wasn't born into the Wild West. He wasn't raised around saloons or shootouts. No, Doc was born into a world of manners, education, and Southern charm. His father, Major Henry Holliday, was a respected man, a veteran who had served in several wars, including the Mexican-American War. He was strict but honorable, the kind of man who believed in discipline and reputation. His mother, Alice Jane, was gentle, kind, and deeply loving. She adored her son and taught him how to read, write, and speak like a true gentleman. Doc grew up surrounded by books, piano music, and family pride. He learned Latin, Greek, and the art of conversation. He had a sharp mind, the kind of intelligence that made him stand out even as a boy. But behind the comfort of his home, the winds of change were blowing through the South. The Civil War tore families apart, burned towns, and destroyed the old world that the Hollidays knew. When the war ended, nothing was the same. But young John Henry had a dream. He wanted to become a doctor. And for a while, it seemed like that dream might come true. At the age of 20, he left home to study at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia. He worked hard, graduated in 1872, and earned the title of Doctor of Dental Surgery. He was young, charming, and full of life, a handsome man with sharp blue eyes and a polite smile. People liked him instantly. He opened a small dental practice in Atlanta, Georgia, and for a brief moment, life was peaceful. But one morning, he started coughing. At first, he thought it was nothing, maybe dust, maybe exhaustion. But the cough grew worse. Then came the blood. Doc went to a physician, who told him the words that would change his life forever. You have tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed his mother years before. The doctor told him there was no cure. He might live a few years, maybe less. He should rest, move to a warmer, drier climate. That was his only chance. So with nothing left to lose, Doc packed up his life and left Georgia behind. He left his practice, his friends, and the man he used to be. He was only 22 years old, and already living on borrowed time. Doc traveled west in search of dry air and new beginnings. He ended up in Dallas, Texas, where the world was rough, loud, and alive. The West wasn't like Georgia. Here men lived fast and died faster. Law was a matter of bullets, and survival meant being tougher than the next man. Doc tried to keep his old life alive, setting up a dental practice with another doctor. But business was bad. Patients didn't trust a sickly, coughing dentist. So Doc began to spend more time in saloons, places full of cards, whiskey, and risk. There he found something unexpected. He had a natural talent for gambling. His mind, trained for precision and logic, made him a master of cards. He started making more money at the poker table than in his dental chair. And slowly the dentist's tools gathered dust, while the cards and revolvers became his new instruments. Doc Holliday was changing. The polite Southern gentleman was fading away, replaced by something harder, sharper, colder. Tuberculosis had given him a death sentence, and that made him fearless. He didn't care if a fight broke out. He didn't care if someone drew a gun. He had already accepted his fate. They say that made him dangerous. But it also made him legendary. He became known in Dallas as a gambler with quick hands and a quicker temper. He wasn't a big man, thin, pale, often coughing into his handkerchief. But when he reached for his pistol, nobody laughed. In every town he visited, stories followed. Some said he cheated. Others said he killed men who tried to rob him. No one really knew how many fights he survived. But one thing was certain. Doc Holliday was no longer a dentist. He had become a drifter, a gambler, and a gunslinger. But destiny wasn't done with him yet. Because one day, in a smoky saloon in Fort Griffin, Texas, Doc Holliday would meet a man who would change his life. A man wearing a badge, chasing outlaws and walking straight into legend. That man's name was Wyatt Earp, and together, They were about to write one of the most unforgettable chapters in the history of the Wild West. Doc Holliday wasn't born a killer. He was made by pain, by fate, and by the ticking clock of his own mortality. But this was only the beginning. After leaving Georgia behind, Doc Holliday had become a man on the move. He was young, handsome, and dying. But he refused to let that stop him. Each new town he entered was a fresh start, and each poker table was a chance to make his fortune. Or lose it. In Dallas, Texas, Doc tried to keep one foot in the world of dentistry. He opened a small practice with another dentist, hoping to rebuild his career. But the truth was simple. No one wanted a dentist who coughed blood into a handkerchief. The West was wild and unkind. People didn't care about polite manners or fancy education. They cared about survival, about who was strong enough to stand their ground. Doc soon realized that being Dr. Holliday wasn't going to keep him alive. So he adapted. He found a new profession, one that didn't depend on trust or health. He became a professional gambler. At first, gambling was just a way to pay the bills. But as days turned into nights and the whiskey flowed freely, Doc discovered something about himself. He had a sharp mind, calm under pressure, able to read people's faces and intentions like an open book. He could sit at a poker table for hours, outsmarting men twice his size and 3 times his strength. He didn't cheat. He didn't have to. His intelligence was his weapon, and his charm was his shield. People began to notice him. The tall, thin man in the corner who coughed between hands but never lost focus. They started calling him Doc. Part nickname, part reminder of who he used to be. And soon, Doc Holliday became a name known across the gambling halls of the frontier. But the West wasn't just about cards. It was about pride, tempers, and the quick pull of a trigger. Wherever money moved, trouble followed, and Doc seemed to attract both. When he won, someone accused him of cheating. When he lost, someone called him a liar. Every argument seemed to end with a hand on a revolver. The first time he killed a man, witnesses said it was self-defense. A drunk had drawn on him during a game, and Doc fired first. The man fell to the floor before he could blink. From that moment on, Doc's reputation spread like wildfire. People whispered that he was dangerous, that his smile was polite, but his aim was deadly. He didn't brag about it. He didn't seem proud, but deep down, he knew something had changed. Once you take a life, you can never go back to who you were before. Doc drifted from town to town, Denison, Denton, Jacksboro, and beyond, chasing luck and staying one step ahead of the law. He made friends where he could and enemies without trying. Sometimes he won fortunes at the tables. Other times he barely escaped with his life. He had become part of the fabric of the frontier, a ghostly figure who appeared in one town, caused a stir, then vanished to the next. His illness followed him everywhere. He coughed constantly, pale and exhausted, but he never complained. Some said he didn't fear death anymore. Maybe they were right. When a man knows his days are numbered, fear loses its power. And that made Doc Holliday one of the most dangerous men in the West. Still, there were flashes of the man he once was. He loved music, conversation, and fine clothes. Even in dusty saloons he dressed like a gentleman. Pressed shirts, neat vests, polished boots. He spoke softly with the accent of an educated Southerner, which made him stand out even more. But underneath that calm voice was a storm. Years of sickness, rejection, and violence had hardened him. He drank more, slept less. The line between gambler and outlaw grew thinner each day. Doc began to live by a simple rule. If someone threatens you, strike first. He had no patience for insults, no tolerance for cowards. And though he was frail, his confidence made even the toughest men hesitate. It was around this time, in the dusty saloons of Fort Griffin, Texas, that destiny decided to cross his path once again. The town was rough, full of drifters, thieves, and cattlemen looking for trouble. It was the kind of place where lawmen barely held control, and every night could turn deadly. One evening, Doc was sitting at a poker table when a fight broke out nearby. A tall man wearing a badge stepped in, calm and steady, trying to break it up. That man's name was Wyatt Earp. No one could have known it at that moment, but that meeting would become one of the most legendary friendships in American history. Two men, both living on the edge of law and death. One a dying gambler, the other a relentless lawman. Wyatt saw something in Doc, not just courage, but loyalty. a kind of honor hidden beneath the whiskey and the cards. And Doc saw in Wyatt a man he could trust, something rare in the wild chaos of the West. From that day on, their lives would be intertwined. They would fight together, ride together, and face death side by side. For the first time in years, Doc Holliday had something more than cards and whiskey to live for. He had a friend. And though he didn't know it yet, that friendship would lead him straight into the most famous gunfight in Western history, a moment that would make his name echo through time. But before Tombstone, before the OK Corral, there was the bond of two men who understood one truth. In the West, loyalty was rarer than gold, and far more dangerous. When Doc Holliday met Wyatt Earp in Fort Griffin, Texas, it was like two worlds colliding. One was a lawman, tall, calm, and disciplined. The other was a gambler, pale, reckless, and dying. But both men lived by one code. Loyalty meant everything. No one really knows exactly how their friendship began. Some say Wyatt Earp was chasing a criminal named Dave Rudabaugh when he first met Doc. Others say Doc helped Wyatt in a poker room fight that almost turned deadly. Whatever the truth, the two men walked out of that saloon with something rare: respect. Wyatt saw that Doc wasn't like other men. He wasn't afraid of dying. He wasn't afraid of anything. And Doc saw that Wyatt had something he'd lost a long time ago: purpose. That bond would shape both their destinies. Doc started traveling where Wyatt went. If Wyatt took a job as a lawman, Doc would often be nearby, gambling, watching, keeping an eye out for trouble. He wasn't a deputy. He wasn't wearing a badge. But when Wyatt needed him, Doc was there. It wasn't about law or money. It was about friendship, the kind that only exists between men who have seen death and refuse to bow to it. In Dodge City, Kansas, the pair became a familiar sight. Wyatt patrolled the streets, trying to bring order to a town full of drunks, thieves, and outlaws. Doc played cards at the saloons, coughing between drinks, his pale face glowing in the lamplight. He had a reputation now, half legend, half warning. Men who didn't know him often mistook his quiet manners for weakness. They learned quickly that was a mistake. If you crossed Doc Holliday, you might not live to regret it. Wyatt often had to step in, calming situations before they turned bloody. But sometimes even he couldn't stop what came next. Doc was fast, faster than anyone expected. And when he drew his pistol, it was already too late. Despite his violent reputation, there was a strange nobility about him. He hated bullies. He despised cowards. He stood up for Wyatt and for the few people he respected. But make no mistake, if you threatened his friends, Doc would end you without hesitation. In the years that followed, Doc became both a protector and a problem. Some towns welcomed him because he brought money, charm, and excitement. Others ran him out because he brought gunfire and chaos. He couldn't stay in one place too long, but no matter where he went, Wyatt Earp was never far behind. Their friendship was built on shared danger and unspoken loyalty. People called them brothers, even though they weren't by blood. And then came Tombstone, Arizona. Tombstone wasn't just another dusty town. It was booming. Rich silver mines, busy streets, and a reputation for opportunity. But like every place that promised gold, it also attracted greed and crime. Gangs of outlaws known as the Cowboys ruled the area, robbing stagecoaches and terrorizing ranchers. The law struggled to keep up. Wyatt Earp saw a chance to change that. He came to Tombstone with his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, to find work and bring order to the town. And, as always, Doc Holliday followed. He arrived coughing, tired, but still sharp as ever. Some said Wyatt had begged him to stay away, to rest, to save his strength. But Doc refused. Where Wyatt went, he went too. He would rather die fighting beside a friend than live doing nothing. At first, things in Tombstone seemed peaceful. Wyatt worked as a deputy, his brothers took jobs as lawmen, and Doc made himself known at the poker tables. He was charming when sober, deadly when drunk, and unpredictable in between. Even the cowboys, men like Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, and the McClory brothers, learned to keep their distance. But trouble in Tombstone was never far away. The tension between the Earps and the cowboys grew by the day. Accusations of theft, corruption, and revenge filled the air like smoke. One side claimed to represent justice. The other claimed to represent freedom. And stuck in the middle was a sickly gambler with a gun, Doc Holliday. He didn't wear a badge, but everyone knew which side he was on. If the Earps were threatened, Doc was their shadow. If someone cursed their name, Doc was the one who answered. Wyatt often tried to calm things down, but Doc's loyalty made that impossible. To him, the cowboys were nothing but criminals, loud, cruel men who preyed on the weak. And Doc had no patience for men like that. The cowboys, in turn, hated him. They called him the killer dentist. They mocked his sickness. And more than once, they swore they'd put him in the ground. But Doc just smiled that thin, tired smile and said, "Say when." By the fall of 1881, Tombstone was ready to explode. Gunfights were breaking out. Threats were shouted across the streets, and both sides were armed and angry. The tension was like dry wood waiting for a spark. And when it came, it would light up the desert. In a matter of days, Doc Holliday would find himself standing beside the Earp brothers, face to face with the cowboys, and staring down the barrels of loaded guns. The quiet dentist from Georgia, the man who once fixed smiles, was now about to make history in one of the most famous gunfights the world would ever know, and as fate would have it. This gunfight would not just define his life, it would define the very legend of the Wild West itself. Tombstone, Arizona, a name that already sounded like trouble. By the early 1880s, it was one of the fastest-growing towns in the West. Silver had been discovered in the desert hills, and fortune seekers poured in from every corner of the country. The streets were filled with miners, gamblers, and dreamers. Money flowed as fast as whiskey, and both drew the kind of men who carried guns instead of manners. To keep the peace, the town needed lawmen. And that's where the Earp brothers came in, Virgil, Morgan, and the famous Wyatt Earp. They were strong, respected, and determined to bring order to the chaos. But in Tombstone, order had enemies. Among the cattlemen and drifters was a group of outlaws known as the Cowboys, a loose band of thieves, rustlers, and gunmen who ran the area like their own kingdom. They stole cattle from Mexico, robbed stagecoaches, and settled arguments with bullets. Their leaders, Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and a few others, believed they were untouchable. The Earps didn't agree. And neither did Doc Holliday. Doc might not have worn a badge, but his loyalty to Wyatt was stronger than any law. Wherever the Earps went, he was there, pale, coughing, and always ready to back them up. At the poker tables, he'd hear whispers about the cowboys, their threats, their plans. Sometimes he'd pass those whispers to Wyatt. Other times he'd handle them himself, usually with sharp words, or sharper steel. To outsiders, it was just another town. But to those who lived there, Tombstone was a powder keg. And every insult, every shove, every glare across a saloon table was another spark waiting to set it off. The tension grew slowly, like a storm building over the desert. The cowboys hated the Earps for interfering in their business. They hated Doc even more, because he never feared them. Ike Clanton, in particular, despised Holliday. He mocked Doc's sickness, called him a drunk, and swore he'd kill him one day. Doc just smiled his cold little smile and said, "I'll be your huckleberry." It was his way of saying, if you're looking for a fight, I'm your man. The townspeople could feel it. Something bad was coming. Arguments turned into street brawls. Men carried guns openly, even inside saloons. And every night, someone whispered about blood in the streets. Doc stayed close to Wyatt, even when the lawmen urged him to rest. He was weaker now, coughing more often, his hands shaking slightly when he drank. But his eyes, those sharp, fearless eyes, never changed. He knew death was coming, but he was determined to choose how he'd meet it. By October 1881, things had reached the breaking point. Ike Clanton and the cowboys were openly threatening the Earps. They swore to shoot them on sight. On the night of October 25th, Doc was drinking in a saloon when Ike Clanton walked in, angry and armed. The two men argued loudly. Ike accused Doc of plotting against him. Doc, never one to back down, told Ike he was a liar and a coward. Witnesses said the room went silent, every man waiting for someone to draw first. But before guns were fired, Ike stormed out, swearing revenge. The next morning, he was seen on the streets, still armed and shouting that he'd kill every one of the Earps. Word spread fast. Tombstone's main street filled with whispers and fear. The law said men couldn't carry weapons inside town. And Virgil Earp, now city marshal, decided it was time to act. That afternoon, the Earps prepared to disarm the cowboys. Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan were joined by Doc Holliday, who tucked a shotgun under his coat despite his sickness. He was pale, coughing, but calm. Wyatt looked at him and said quietly, "You don't have to do this, Doc." Doc smirked, his voice rough but steady. "That's a hell of a thing for you to say." And with that, they walked down Fremont Street side by side. 4 men against 5, lawmen against outlaws, honor against chaos. At the other end of town, near a small empty lot behind a boarding house and the OK Corral, the cowboys stood waiting, Ike and Billy Clanton, Tom and Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. They were armed and angry, their hands close to their holsters. The street was quiet except for boots scraping the dirt. The air was thick with tension. People watched from windows, knowing something unforgettable was about to happen. When the Earps and Doc turned the corner, time seemed to stop. 2 groups stood face to face, just a few yards apart. No one knew who would shoot first, but everyone knew someone would die. Doc looked across at the cowboys, the sunlight catching the barrel of his shotgun. He coughed once, smiled faintly, and said, "You sons of bitches have been looking for a fight. Now you can have it." Those words hung in the air, and then, in less than 30 seconds, the West exploded. Gunfire echoed through Tombstone. Smoke filled the street. Men shouted, fell, and fired again. It was chaos, fast, brutal, and unforgettable. When it was over, 3 men lay dead. The rest of the world would remember it forever as the gunfight at the OK Corral. That day, Doc Holliday stopped being just a gambler or a gunfighter. He became something else, a legend. But legends come with a price. And the blood spilled in Tombstone was only the beginning of the cost that Doc and Wyatt would have to pay. The morning of October 26, 1881, was quiet in Tombstone, Arizona. But under that calm silence, the town was ready to explode. The tension between the Earp brothers and the cowboys had finally reached its limit. For months they had traded insults, threats, and gunfire in the shadows. Now it was going to end, one way or another. Doc Holliday woke up that morning coughing blood. He was pale and weak, but his mind was sharp as ever. He knew there would be a fight that day, and he knew he couldn't stay out of it. When Wyatt came to his room, Doc didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Where are they?" Wyatt told him the cowboys were gathering near the OK Corral, armed, angry, and waiting. Doc stood, dressed slowly, and reached for his pistol. He slid a shotgun under his coat, hiding the barrel beneath his long jacket. He was sick, dying even, but in that moment, he was fearless. He wasn't walking into death. He was walking into history. Just before 3 p.m., Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Virgil Earp, and Morgan Earp began their walk down Fremont Street. They moved in a straight line, calm, steady, silent. People watched from windows and doorways, knowing they were about to see something unforgettable. The air was thick with dust and tension. Every step echoed through the street. Some said you could feel the fear, like thunder before lightning. At the other end of the lot, the cowboys waited. Ike Clanton, Billy Clanton, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Claiborne. They had their hands near their guns, muttering curses under their breath. Ike, who had shouted for blood all morning, suddenly looked uneasy when the Earps arrived. Virgil Earp, the city marshal, stepped forward and said, "Throw up your hands, I want your guns." For a moment, no one moved. Then everything happened at once, a gun fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger first. But in an instant, the quiet streets of Tombstone exploded with the sound of gunfire. Doc Holliday swung his shotgun up and fired at Tom McClory from close range. The blast hit him in the chest, throwing him backward into the dust. Billy Clanton fired back, hitting Morgan Earp. Frank McClory drew fast and shot at Virgil. Wyatt returned fire, striking Frank in the stomach. In just a few seconds, the empty lot became a storm of bullets and smoke. Men shouted, stumbled, reloaded, and fired again. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Horses screamed in the background as people ran for cover. Doc dropped the shotgun, drew his revolver, and fired again, coughing hard between each shot. He moved with strange calmness, like a man who'd made peace with death long ago. A bullet tore through his coat, grazing his side, but he didn't flinch. He kept firing. He kept fighting. When the shooting finally stopped, it had lasted less than 30 seconds. 30 seconds, that's all it took to make history. 3 men were dead. Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday was bleeding, his lungs burning, but he was still standing. Wyatt Earp hadn't been hit at all. The streets went silent again. People came out slowly, staring at the bodies lying in the dirt. Some called it justice. Others called it murder. Doc wiped blood from his lip and said softly, "They started it." That was the only explanation he ever gave. Word spread across the country within days. Newspapers called it the gunfight at the OK Corral. Some painted the Earps and Doc as heroes who stood against lawlessness. Others called them killers in badges. But whatever people believed, one thing was certain. Doc Holliday was now a legend. In the days that followed, tension in Tombstone only grew worse. The cowboys wanted revenge. They waited in the shadows, plotting their next move. Doc, Wyatt, and the Earp brothers faced endless threats. On the streets, whispers turned into open hatred. Men pointed at them in saloons and called them murderers. Even the law couldn't decide who was right. Doc was arrested, charged with murder, and dragged into court alongside the Earps. The trial lasted weeks. Witnesses gave conflicting stories, some claiming the cowboys had raised their guns first, others saying the Earps had. But in the end, the judge ruled in their favor. They had acted within the law. The charges were dropped. Still, the victory felt hollow. The town was divided, and the cowboys were hungry for revenge. Doc Holliday had survived the most famous gunfight in American history, but he knew the war was far from over. For the rest of his life, he would be both celebrated and condemned. Some saw him as a hero who defended his friends against evil. Others saw him as a reckless killer who hid behind a badge. But Doc didn't care what people thought. He never had. He once told a friend, "There's no normal life, Wyatt. There's just life. Now get on with it." He had lived by that rule from the day he first coughed blood into his handkerchief. And after Tombstone, he would need it more than ever, because revenge was coming. And this time, death wouldn't wait quietly in the background. It would ride through the desert, cold and merciless. With the name Earp Vendetta Ride, and Doc Holliday would be right there, coughing, bleeding, but still pulling the trigger. After the gunfight at the OK Corral, Tombstone was never the same. The street was still stained with blood, and the sound of gunfire still echoed in people's memories. But the fight wasn't over, not even close. The cowboys wanted revenge. The Earps wanted justice. And standing right beside Wyatt Earp, as always, was Doc Holliday, coughing, bleeding, and ready for war. In the weeks after the gunfight, Tombstone was a town divided. Some saw the Earps as heroes who had stood up to lawlessness. Others called them murderers with badges. Every man in that dusty town had an opinion, and every opinion carried a gun. Doc didn't care what people said. He had fought for his friends, and he'd do it again. He spent most of his time guarding Wyatt, drinking whiskey and keeping his pistol close. His health was getting worse. He was coughing blood more often now, and his skin was pale and thin. But he hid it behind sarcasm and laughter. Someone once asked him why he kept fighting when he could barely breathe. Doc just smiled and said, "Because they're still breathing." Then, one cold night, everything changed. On December 28, 1881, Virgil Earp, the town marshal and Wyatt's older brother, was walking down the street when gunmen ambushed him. Bullets tore through his arm, nearly killing him. He survived, but barely. The cowboys denied being involved, but everyone knew the truth. For Wyatt and Doc, that was it. It wasn't about law anymore. It was personal. Still, Wyatt tried to keep the peace. He stayed in town, watching over Virgil while waiting for the law to act. But justice in Tombstone came slowly, if it came at all, and then the cowboys struck again. On the night of March 18, 1882, Morgan Earp was shot and killed while playing pool. The bullet went straight through his back. Wyatt held his brother as he died, blood spreading across the floorboards. Morgan whispered his last words, "Don't let them get away." That was the moment Wyatt Earp changed. He wasn't just a lawman anymore. He was a man on a mission, and he would bring vengeance with him. And standing right beside him, coughing into a handkerchief, was Doc Holliday. The newspapers later called it the Earp Vendetta Ride, but to Wyatt and Doc, it was simply payback. They gathered a small posse, Wyatt, Doc, Warren Earp, Sherman McMaster, and a few trusted friends. Together they rode out into the desert, hunting the men responsible for Morgan's death. They didn't wear badges this time. There would be no trials, no courts, and no second chances. Wyatt told Doc, "You don't have to come. Doc coughed, smiled weakly, and said, "That's a hell of a thing for you to say." And with that, the dying gambler saddled up and rode into the Arizona wilderness. They tracked the cowboys for days, across dry canyons, dusty plains, and cold desert nights. Wyatt rode like a man possessed, silent and relentless. Doc followed close behind, his cough echoing through the still air. When they finally caught up with Frank Stillwell, one of the men behind Morgan's murder, Wyatt shot him dead on the spot. No warning, no hesitation. It was justice, Earp style. After that, the vendetta turned bloody. Wyatt's posse killed several more cowboys, including Indian Charlie Cruz and Florentino Cruz. Each one fell in quick. Brutal confrontations that sent shockwaves through Arizona. The newspapers called it a manhunt. The law called it murder. But to Wyatt and Doc, it was justice served, hot and final. For Doc, the ride was both triumph and torment. Every day his sickness grew worse. He coughed until he bled, sometimes too weak to stay in the saddle. But he refused to stop. He rode on because loyalty meant everything. Wyatt would later say, "Doc was the most loyal man I ever knew." He wasn't wrong. Doc could have stayed behind in a warm saloon with whiskey and cards. Instead, he chose the desert, the danger, and the gunfire, because his friend needed him. After weeks on the run, the posse scattered. The law was closing in, and both Wyatt and Doc had become wanted men. They were outlaws now, just like the ones they'd hunted. They escaped to Colorado, far from the burning sun of Arizona. Doc was exhausted. The coughing fits were worse. His hands shook and his once sharp eyes looked tired and hollow. But even as he grew weaker, he never complained. He played poker, smiled at the jokes, and told stories about the old days in Tombstone. To anyone watching, he looked like a man at peace, but inside, he knew his time was running out. He had fought every battle life threw at him, disease, fear, enemies, death itself, and somehow he had survived them all. But Doc Holliday's war wasn't over yet. There was one more fight left, a fight not against men, but against the ticking clock of his own body. And this time, no gun could save him. The Arizona desert was quiet again. The gunfire had faded. The blood had dried. But for Doc Holliday, the war wasn't truly over, because his greatest enemy was waiting inside him, tuberculosis. It had been there since he was a young man, whispering in the back of his lungs, reminding him that time was running out. Now, after years of gunfights, whiskey, and sleepless nights, the disease was winning. After the Vendetta Ride, Doc and Wyatt Earp fled Arizona. The law wanted them both, and the cowboys who remained wanted revenge. They rode through New Mexico and eventually made their way to Colorado, trying to disappear from the chaos they had left behind. Wyatt was still strong, focused, serious, determined to build a new life. But Doc was fading. He coughed through every night, his breathing rough and shallow. Even whiskey, his old friend, couldn't quiet the pain anymore. He spent most of his time in saloons, sitting at poker tables with trembling hands, still trying to act like the sharp gambler he once was. Sometimes he won. Sometimes he just stared at the cards, lost in thought. People still feared him, though. Even sick and thin, Doc Holliday had an air of danger about him. He spoke softly, smiled rarely, and carried himself like a man who had seen death up close, and didn't care if he met it again. Once, a young gunslinger tried to test him in a bar, calling him out and reaching for his pistol. Doc didn't even move. He just looked at the man and said, "I'm dying anyway, son. You sure you want to risk joining me?" The boy walked away. Doc laughed until he started coughing, his laughter turning into a wheeze. He joked that even death was afraid to play cards with him. Despite everything, Doc stayed close to Wyatt for a while. They were brothers in arms, tied together by loyalty and bloodshed. But time began to pull them apart. Wyatt moved on, chasing new ventures, always searching for peace. Doc couldn't follow. His body wouldn't let him. He drifted from one dusty town to another. Leadville, Denver, Glenwood Springs, always chasing a little warmth, a little comfort, and one more good hand of poker. In Leadville, he got into one last gunfight, shooting a man who tried to rob him. He was arrested, but later acquitted. Even near death, his aim was true. But the sickness didn't stop. By the mid-1880s, he could barely walk without coughing fits. His once handsome face was thin and sunken, his voice little more than a whisper. When doctors told him there was nothing left to do but rest, Doc did something surprising. He actually listened. He traveled to Glenwood Springs, Colorado, a small town known for its hot mineral baths. The doctors there said the warm, humid air might help his lungs. It didn't. In fact, it made things worse. Still, Doc tried to keep up appearances. He stayed at the Hotel Glenwood, where he became a familiar sight, a thin man in fine clothes, sitting quietly, sometimes joking with guests, sometimes staring out the window at the mountains. Locals said he could be charming one moment and irritable the next. He was tired, not just in body but in spirit. He had lived his life on the edge, and now there was nowhere left to run. Friends visited when they could, bringing him whiskey, cards, and stories from the frontier. They said he still had his sharp tongue. When someone mentioned that most men who lived his life would have died years ago, Doc smirked and said, "That's the advantage of being half dead already." But deep down, he knew his time had come. In his final months, he was too weak to leave his bed. His guns were gone. His cards lay untouched. The man who had once walked into gunfights without fear could now barely lift a glass. He didn't beg for mercy. He didn't pray for more time. He just waited, calm, patient, almost amused. People always said Doc Holliday would die with a gun in his hand. But fate had one last joke left for him. On November 8, 1887, Doc woke early. He looked at his bare feet sticking out from under the blanket, smiled faintly and said, "This is funny." Those were his last words. Moments later, the man who had cheated death for years finally lost the game, quietly, peacefully, in bed. He was 36 years old. They buried him in Linwood Cemetery, on a hill overlooking the town of Glenwood Springs. No one knows exactly where his grave lies. The records were lost long ago. But somewhere under that rocky ground rests the man who once said he'd rather die standing than live crawling. Doc Holliday's story didn't end in a blaze of gunfire. It ended the way he least expected, in silence. But that silence became something eternal. Because the legend of Doc Holliday, the gambler, the gunfighter, the loyal friend, still lives wherever tales of the Wild West are told. When Doc Holliday took his final breath in that quiet Colorado hotel room, the story should have ended there. A sick man, only 36 years old, gone before his time. But death couldn't bury his legend. If anything, it only made it stronger. News of Doc's passing spread slowly across the West. In the saloons and mining towns where his name was once whispered with fear, men lifted their glasses and said, "Here's to Doc." Some called him a killer. Some called him a hero. But everyone agreed there would never be another like him. Wyatt Earp was still alive when he heard the news. By then, he was far from Tombstone, trying to start over. When someone told him that Doc had died, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Doc Holliday was my friend." It was a simple sentence, but it said everything. For years, Wyatt and Doc had ridden side by side through gunfire, dust, and blood. They had saved each other's lives more than once. They had laughed, fought, and buried brothers together. Doc had no family left, but Wyatt had been the closest thing he ever had to one. Wyatt would go on to live a long life. He'd move from town to town, chasing new opportunities, working as a gambler, lawman, and sometimes even an actor. But no matter where he went, people always asked him the same thing. "Tell us about Doc Holliday." And Wyatt would smile that small, distant smile and say, he was the best friend a man could have. After his death, stories about Doc Holliday began to grow, stories bigger than the man himself. In every town, the tale changed a little. Some said he'd killed over 30 men. Others said he could outdraw anyone in the West. The truth was simpler. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but he was the bravest. Because he had nothing to lose. When a man knows death is coming, fear disappears. That's what made Doc dangerous. That's what made him unforgettable. Writers began to tell his story in dime novels and newspapers. They painted him as a tragic anti-hero, a man cursed by fate but guided by loyalty. Some made him sound like a villain. Others, like a knight in dusty boots. The reality was somewhere in between. Doc Holliday wasn't a saint. He gambled, drank too much, and carried more pride than sense. But when his friends needed him, he stood his ground, even when he could barely stand at all. And in the Wild West, that meant something. Years later, Hollywood discovered him. The silver screen turned him into an icon. In the 1930s, Cesar Romero played him as a charming rogue. In the 1950s, Kirk Douglas gave him cold intensity, and in 1993, Val Kilmer brought him back to life with the famous line, "I'm your Huckleberry." That line, spoken with a smirk and a cough, became immortal, just like the man himself. Val Kilmer's version of Doc Holliday showed the world the complexity of his character, a man full of charm and death, humor and sorrow, courage and pain. It wasn't just a gunfighter's story anymore. It was the story of a man trying to live before he died. Today, more than a century later, Doc Holliday's name still echoes through the legends of the Old West. Walk into any Western museum or old saloon in Arizona, and you'll find his photo. Thin face, sharp eyes, that quiet look of confidence. People still visit Glenwood Springs to see the cemetery where he was buried. They leave playing cards, poker chips, and whiskey bottles on his grave. It's their way of saying thanks, not for his guns, but for his spirit, because Doc Holliday wasn't just a gunfighter. He was a symbol of something deeper, the courage to face death with a grin, the loyalty to stand by a friend when the world turns against you, and the strength to keep living even when you know your time is almost gone. Historians still argue about the details, how many men he killed, what really happened at the OK Corral, what kind of man he truly was. But those details don't matter as much as what he represented. He was a man torn between two worlds, the Southern gentleman he was raised to be, and the gunslinger the West forced him to become, and somehow he carried both with pride. He wore fine clothes, spoke like an educated man, but drew his gun faster than anyone dared to test. He could quote poetry one minute and pull a trigger the next. That contradiction, that mix of refinement and recklessness, is what made him legendary. In the end, Doc Holliday's story isn't just about the Wild West. It's about life, death, and how we choose to face them. He knew his time was short, but he refused to live small. He laughed, fought, gambled, and loved fiercely until his last breath. And maybe that's why his legend never died. Because deep down, everyone envies the man who looked death in the eyes and smiled back. Doc Holliday was gone, buried on a cold November morning in Colorado, but his story refused to stay in the ground. It spread like wildfire across the frontier, carried by travelers, gamblers, and drifters who claimed to have known him. Some told stories that painted him as a devil in human form. Others spoke of him like a tragic saint, a man who fought fate with a pistol in one hand and a cough in the other. And somewhere between the two lay the truth. In the years after his death, America changed. The frontier began to close. Railroads replaced horses, towns grew into cities, and the Wild West, that rough, lawless world of guns, saloons, and outlaws, became something people longed for but could never get back. Doc Holliday became one of its most enduring ghosts. His name began appearing in dime novels, those cheap paperbacks that told thrilling tales of gunfights and heroes. But the men who wrote them didn't care much for facts. They wanted excitement, and Doc gave them plenty to work with. In some stories, he was a ruthless killer who shot men for fun. In others, he was a dying hero who fought for justice. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the feeling, that dangerous, exciting spirit of the untamed West. And soon, that feeling became a legend. By the early 1900s, people were already calling him the most dangerous man in the West. His story was passed from generation to generation, whispered in bars, told around campfires, and written into the pages of history books. But what made Doc's legend different from other gunfighters like Billy the Kid or Jesse James was this: Doc Holliday didn't fight for greed or fame. He fought for loyalty. He didn't rob banks or lead gangs. He followed one man, Wyatt Earp, and stood by him through every danger, every bullet, every loss. It wasn't about money or reputation. It was about friendship, and that made him human. People could relate to that. Everyone understands what it means to protect someone you care about, even if it means losing everything else. As America grew older, so did its fascination with men like Doc. Movies, books, and songs turned him into a symbol, not just of the Wild West, but of a bigger idea, living fearlessly in the face of death. To a country that admired courage, independence, and rebellion, Doc Holliday was perfect. He was flawed but brave, sick but unbreakable, educated yet deadly, a man who lived hard, loved deep, and died with a grin. That contradiction, that mix of light and shadow, made him unforgettable. In the decades that followed, his legend took on new life through Hollywood. In black and white films of the 1930s, Doc was portrayed as charming and witty. In the 1950s, he became darker, a man torn between violence and honor. And in 1993, Val Kilmer's version of Doc Holliday in Tombstone captured everything at once. The humor, the sickness, the pain, and the courage. When Kilmer delivered the now iconic line, "I'm your huckleberry," the world rediscovered Doc Holliday, not just as a gunslinger, but as a man with style, class, and soul. That movie introduced a new generation to his story, and suddenly, people everywhere were quoting his words, studying his life, and debating who the real Doc Holliday truly was. Historians still can't agree. Was he a hero or a villain? A cold-blooded killer or a loyal friend trapped in a violent world? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. He was both sinner and savior, both refined and ruthless. He was a man made by his time and by his disease. Tuberculosis had already taken everything from him, his health, his career, his future. So he lived each day like it might be his last, because it probably was, and that's what makes his story timeless. Because deep down, we all know that life is short. Most of us just pretend we have more time. But Doc Holliday didn't pretend. He lived on borrowed time, and he made every second count, even today. More than a century later, people still visit the Doc Holliday Museum in Glenwood Springs or walk through Tombstone, where reenactments of the OK Corral still play out in the streets. His image appears on t-shirts, posters, and even playing cards. Tourists still whisper the same question. Was Doc Holliday really that brave? And maybe the better question is, would we be that brave if we knew we were dying? That's the part of Doc Holliday that still fascinates people. He wasn't fearless because he was strong. He was fearless because he was dying. And in that strange, tragic truth, people find something beautiful. Doc Holliday's life teaches one powerful lesson. You don't choose how long you live. But you do choose how you live. He chose loyalty over safety, friendship over fear, and courage over comfort. He lived loud, laughed often, and faced death with wit instead of weakness. And in the end, that's why we still talk about him. Not because he won every fight, but because he never ran from one, not even the last one. More than a century has passed since Doc Holliday drew his last breath in that quiet Colorado room. But his name still lives, whispered in saloons, painted on movie posters, and carved into the heart of American folklore. The man is gone. But the story? The story never died. When people speak of the Old West, they speak of outlaws and sheriffs, of dusty streets and duels at sunrise. But behind every tale of the frontier, there is one name that rises above the rest: John Henry Doc Holliday. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West. He wasn't the strongest or the most ruthless. But he was something rarer, a man who refused to surrender, even when death itself had already claimed him. His life was short, chaotic, and filled with violence, but it was also full of loyalty, laughter, and courage. In every card he dealt, every bullet he fired, and every word he spoke, there was a man trying to prove one thing: that even a dying man could live more fiercely than anyone else alive. Doc Holliday's legend isn't just about gunfights or fame, it's about defiance. He stood against fear, against pain, against the limits of time. He knew the clock was ticking, yet he chose to live boldly anyway. In that choice lies the secret to why we still talk about him today. Because in a world full of men who play it safe, Doc played for everything, even when he had nothing left to lose. The West shaped him, but it also revealed him. He came from a world of manners and marble halls, raised as a Southern gentleman with fine clothes and finer words. But the frontier stripped away all of that and left only what mattered: courage, wit, and the will to keep standing. He was a man divided, one half polished and proper, the other wild and deadly. He could quote Latin one moment and pull a trigger the next. He was both the doctor and the destroyer, the healer and the killer. That duality, that contradiction, is what makes him timeless. It reminds us that greatness often lives in the gray areas, not the black and white. Wyatt Earp lived long after Doc was gone. He grew old, told stories, and watched as the world around him changed. But until his dying day, he never forgot his friend. Whenever someone asked about Doc, Wyatt would pause, look away, and smile softly. He'd say, "Doc Holliday was the most loyal man I ever knew. Loyalty. That's the word that defines him more than any gunfight or legend ever could. He lived and died by it. He fought not for fame, but for the few people who stood beside him when no one else would. In a world full of liars and cowards, that kind of loyalty was rare and dangerous. Today, historians still debate who the real Doc Holliday was. Was he a killer, a savior, a hero? The truth is simple. He was human, flawed, broken, brilliant, and brave. He drank too much, gambled too often, and let his temper lead him into trouble. But he also had heart, the kind that doesn't show up in history books. The kind that makes you walk into a gunfight beside your friend, even when you can barely stand. That's not evil. That's devotion. And that's what made him unforgettable. In Glenwood Springs, people still visit his grave. They leave whiskey bottles, poker cards, and flowers, little offerings to a man who lived on his own terms. They look at the mountains and the silence and wonder what kind of man could face death with a smirk and say, "This is funny." Maybe he wasn't laughing at death itself. Maybe he was laughing at the irony, that after all the chaos, all the danger, all the nights he expected to die in a gunfight, he went peacefully in bed, looking at his bare feet. That moment, small, strange, human, is what makes his story real. Not the shootouts, not the fame, but the simple truth that even legends die like men. Doc Holliday's story isn't about the Wild West. It's about us. About what we do when life pushes us to the edge. Do we give up? Or do we stand tall, even when we know the end is near? Doc chose to stand. He lived fast, spoke fearlessly, and died laughing. And in that, he became immortal. Because every time someone watches Tombstone, every time someone says, "I'm your Huckleberry," every time someone raises a glass to loyalty and courage, Doc Holliday lives again, not as a ghost, but as a reminder. A reminder that life isn't about how long you live. It's about how bravely you live it.